What a lovely interlude after such a stirring prayer. August 63 was not my first encounter with the nonviolent movement. It was churches in North Carolina, Greensboro, in 1959 that taught my Aggie friends at North Carolina A&T to be selfless and withstand the spitting in their faces and other abuses as they integrated the lunch counter, which was their target. The march on Washington was something I would not miss, nor did my mother and my brother. We stood near the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and several of the speakers, who I was familiar with, spoke clearly about what was going on and what was needed. Mahalia Jackson sang her heart out, and afterwards encouraged Martin Luther King to leave his prepared speech and speak about his dream. Most Americans can only talk about the dream and even think Martin Luther King Jr. was a dreamer, but on the contrary, he was an activist. His activism paved the way for my personal advancement in life. Freedom Summer civil rights worker James Reeb was murdered in Mississippi the next year, 1964. Remember that the Selma March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge was just 4 years later when Viola Liuzzo was murdered by Alabama troopers. Both were UUs. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered that same year. The very next day, I gave my first public speech to a couple of thousand people at UConn, which was the start of my personal activism there at UConn and in Connecticut. It was around the same time, a bit before, I think, that I found UU in Storrs, Connecticut. What a surprise that there were people who thought like me and accepted me as a thinker with thoughts that matter. Believe me, racism really is something when it comes to white people believing you're able to think. You helped me by verifying my personal value and helped me to speak my mind in this difficult world. Today, UU has the possibility to be the leader of the spiritual world, but not if we only talk to ourselves. Just yesterday, here in Annapolis, people from all over Maryland gathered in March from the Navy Marine Stadium to Susan Campbell Park at the dock to reflect on the 60 years since the March on Washington. They marched up Clay Street and past the Banneker Douglas Museum on the way to the docks and the park. The trek reminded us of the dissolution of the thriving black downtown that was cleared out for government purposes, leaving poor people, but not those who own the homes they removed, and moving other poor to low-income housing with no educated leaders and to the outskirts of town. Segregated Annapolis became even more segregated and even more distant from resources needed for solid community living, not your beloved community. Martin Luther King Jr. was focused on eliminating poverty when he was killed. So where are we 60 years later?
While Thornell was marching in 1963, I was a sophomore in a small Maryland college. Later, at a college reunion, my class was informed that the college intentionally kept us sheltered and isolated from the rest of the world. This aligned perfectly with my life growing up in a small, highly segregated Maryland Eastern Shore town. Meanwhile, Thornell was working to recruit more African American youth to his graduate school at UConn. Back at college, we had one small TV in our dorm basement where I first saw the Freedom Riders. I wondered if I would ever be able to protest as they were and view them as sort of radicals. I could live my life without being involved with them, but I was still confused and uncomfortable around people of color. Meanwhile, Thornell was actively engaged in pressuring colleges to include Black history in their curriculum. Me, I just could not understand why we were all so segregated. So as some of us have done here, I joined the UUCA to give my children an understanding of religion and spirituality. I remembered Reverend Fred Muir, our longtime lead minister here, was recognized at the National UU General Assembly for his dedicated service and was given the opportunity to present a sermon of his choosing for our annual National General Assembly congregations. Reverend Fred's sermon had a sobering impact. He predicted that the UUs would likely travel the path of other current denominations whose congregations were just dissolving and falling apart. Reverend Fred declared that the way to prevent that catastrophe was for us to become an anti-racism church and build a strong, beloved community. Although Reverend Fred predicted that our faith was in danger, I now also believe our country cannot prosper unless it transforms into healthy, multicultural communities. This is why so many of us here who have lived through this period with UUCA are so dedicated and passionate about implementing the 8th principle. We see how this community can grow and reflect into the larger world. Over the years, we have educated ourselves and the congregation by offering UUA-sponsored events like Jubilees, 2-day conferences hosted by the regional UU churches, many book reads and many discussions. Special programs were led by the UUCA members. One, called The World We Dream About, was led by 2 of our dedicated leaders who are no longer with us, Diane Goforth, who had created a home for those suffering with AIDS, and Marlene Brown, the first African-American woman to teach at the Naval Academy. A Racial Justice Council was formed, which I co-chaired, that offered a UUA focus on topics such as immigration, white supremacy, and incarceration. Also included were film shorts like Is Racism Making Us Sick? UUCA eventually made an intentional decision to prepare itself and call an African-American minister, which brought us Reverend John. Reverend John brought Robin DiAngelo, a highly respected speaker and author of What Does It Mean to Be White? On her second visit, Thornell organized a county-wide workshop on racism. Thornell also led a strong and intensive class on her book, which included members not only from our congregation, but other local congregations. The class led us to go deep into interpersonal work, not just academic learning. The group, BBC, Building the Beloved Community, continues our education by producing the 8th Principle Practice Series, specific sessions on racism which all members were asked to attend. Our efforts have consisted of visiting speakers, film nights, and ongoing book discussions. Black and white caucus groups were formed to address their concerns. Meanwhile, UUCA has been moving in the direction of a multicultural church, but not without its conflicts and disappointments, both of which are characteristic of doing this kind of work. Some of our recent challenges are: 1, How do we update and address the needs of the new members in this work? 2, how do we address the members here who have not been involved in this work? 3, how do we engage with the sporadic ministerial leadership? 4, how do we help our members be accountable to our 8th principle? So yes, this is messy and challenging work, but it's because of this church that I and others have been able to travel on a transformational path to address our socialized white supremacy identities. Me from a naive, emotionally fragile white woman, so that now I'm no longer uncomfortable around people of color, to find my voice to speak out. It's really liberating. I do not have to fit into a stereotypical white woman role, and I actually do really feel different. I physically feel different. I'm much more authentic, and I feel that this church is where I belong. And I hope UUCA may be a place where you too may feel the same and join us in the commitment and actions needed to continue us on this supremely important journey. Thank you.
So, what is church to UUs? If the principles have any meaning, church should be a place where our efforts to diminish oppression in the lives of ourselves and others should be paramount. In Anne Arundel County, the 7th edition of Poverty Amidst Plenty has been produced, and UUCA seems to have no knowledge of it. Discrimination is alive and well in our county. Does that have anything to do with church? In addition, Maryland students entering kindergarten last year were found to be only 40% ready for kindergarten. And it turns out that's historical. Does this have anything to do with church? If not, what is church? Are we not interested in the families of our county and how they fare? Are we not interested in how our own children will be supported in their lives by fellow citizens and vice versa? It seems to me that living our principles must mean being a good citizen and looking out for other citizens in every aspect of our lives. Surely, if we can have focus on the environment, we must have focus on the lives of people, and people from all walks of life. How are we doing that at UUCA? Although there are in our church individuals who are doing great work in our society, they do not seem to be supported by the church as a whole, and hence the society no longer sees UUCA as a driving force for change. When Speaker Bush was alive, he knew the UUs were going to be on his doorstep to bring about change. Speaker Jones and Governor Moore do not know we exist. When Robin DiAngelo spoke here, the entire political body of leaders knew we were serious about change in interpersonal and institutional relations. We haven't followed up on this effort. When Betsy Craning was music minister, we had a strong relationship with the Black community in Annapolis. We've lost that vital connection and the relationships that ensued. When we had awake services, there was also a connection with community leaders who came and talked with our members. These two-way conversations had a positive effect on our institutional relationships with government and civic organizations. Have we decided that we each should learn to be better people and then just work on our own at it? What is the collective action? Who leads that? Where is the UU voice in our society? Is that important? If so, when will we regain our UU voice in Anne Arundel County and in Maryland? Are we a church or just a bunch of individuals who do great work, or not?
Before I finish up our message for the day, I would like to invite you all to rise up, if willing and able, to give Thornell and any other members who marched on Washington in 1963 a generous thank you for their contribution to the march, the cause, and this church. We couldn't be doing the work we're preparing for today without his leadership and guidance in the path forward he and others here have paved. Commemorate, educate, activate. As we reflect on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, you might note we are not celebrating, we are commemorating. While the work, change, and growth that has happened over the last 60 years are vital to honor, we cannot celebrate because the work is not yet finished. If your first instinct is to jump to all the progress we've made and all the ways both you and our congregation have supported that effort, I understand. It's an easy first thought as liberal, kind white people. We are raising our children not colorblind, but to see the full human standing in front of us. Our kids have friends of mixed races and genders, and we have friends of different genders, sexualities, ages, skin colors, and religion. It is part of why we attend a UU church and identify with the principles and the values of this faith. But as Thornell asked, what is church? Is it individuals working parallel in their own journeys and crossing paths on Sundays? Or is it a place that is larger than the sum of its parts? Paula Cole-Jones, co-writer of the Eighth Principle, calls on us to be a community of communities, and says that we as UU congregations currently think of ourselves in terms of a family metaphor, and I would like to talk a little bit about that. I would like you to think about all of the communities you are a part of. You might be a member of this congregation, you likely work at a job with other people, you exist in a family, both chosen and inherited from your family of origin. You have friend groups, support groups, and maybe are a parent or grandparent, extending your community reach to others you share this stage of life with. You might identify culturally with a group based on race, gender, age, or politics. You might sit on a board or love to play an instrument. We are involved in so many different communities. Now, let me ask you this. Are you walking into all of those spaces with the conflict skills you were intrinsically taught as a child and a young adult? Do you have a fear of speaking up because you will cause conflict or embarrassment? Do you sit through tension you could cut with a knife because to actually address the issue could cause resentment, gossip, or distrust? Does your body get activated and defensive if you mess up because no one gave you the space to make mistakes and learn from them while you were young? If we continue to act like a family unit, like the family unit so many of us grew up in, with hierarchy, justifications that invalidate harm caused, denial of failure or wrongdoing without apology, or tribalism that only protects a chosen few, we will never trust that conflict is for our growth. We won't trust that grace can replace embarrassment, or that elders or leaders don't hold all of the power, and that progress doesn't come from silence. We won't trust that we can try hard things because we're afraid to fail or even to appear to have failed. We won't trust that the members of our church who beat the drum loudly about white supremacy, racism, internalized racism, microaggressions, and patriarchy are doing it so that all of us can be in beloved community together, so that we may then have the skills of community building to bring to the larger world. We cannot act as a family unit. We must act as a community of communities. I would like to give a few examples of how this difference might show up in our lives. If you read the local Capital Gazette, then you've heard about the police officer who was allowed to continue on the force even though he had shared an incredibly racist and violent image of George Floyd's murder. His superiors decided to give him a desk job so he could work 3 more years to retire with benefits. This sounds like family protecting family. Did you also know there's a county and state coalition of activists who are working to make sure that police accountability is with the people they are supposed to serve? That sounds like a community of communities. You may or may not know that our county relocated a thriving Black neighborhood into public housing to build the county building its own garage. All of those people lost an opportunity to have a housing investment to pass down, with the county acting like this was some sort of justifiable family doing what's best for family. Did you know that there are reparations movements beginning in Annapolis that will address the discriminatory practices of urban renewal? This is the work of a community of communities. And the land our beautiful church is on, which was stolen from Piscataway and Susquehannock people, have you heard of land tax and the land back movement? These movements are coming from community of communities. And don't think that we get a pass here in these walls. You may or may not know that we've had multiple BIPOC members put together a report based on UUA's Widening the Circle of Concerned Commissioners report, highlighting ongoing mistakes, harms, and microaggressions to members of our church, or that the group that initially attempted to implement the recommendations in Widening the Circle failed. And you may not know that because talking about these things publicly often makes us feel shame, blame, resentment, and distrust. We must stop being scared, mistrusting, or hopeless if we want to solve these problems. If we are a community of communities, then we have the desire, skills, resilience, and love to uphold and center these voices and these recommendations as a means of collective growth, joy, and liberation. Today, we honor the people who marched on Washington. They began a movement of community by community based on collaboration and abundance, not family trauma, fear, or justification. As we have grown and changed over the last 60 years, we know we can no longer just march. We know we can no longer just educate ourselves and others, as Candy described in her journey and the journey of this congregation. Unitarian Universalists often mistake education for action. But now we must activate, not the trauma and fear in our bodies that holds us down and keeps us quiet, but the communities we are a part of to seek justice in the world. We must activate so that others like Thornell may rest, though we know he's not going to rest. We must activate so that we can participate in building the beloved community we all needed when we were young and the one that is still needed today. I ask you to commit to doing more than you're doing now. Bring these conversations to all of your communities within these walls and beyond. Ask hard questions. It's okay to feel uncomfortable because we as a community can hold you and lift you up. That is why we show up here on Sundays. For more information on how you can become involved, please review the documents in the Google Drive. There's a sheet of paper that was put on your chair. And join us in our after hour today. That has information about the church, the movements within the faith, the BBC, and the larger community opportunities. May we be the example of beloved community of communities for ourselves and our institutions. May it be so.